the interview podcast session. So my name is Siti Nawala. I am representing YSS alumni for IVCO's for Unpacking IVCO 2023 blog post. So hello and welcome so much to everyone. My name is Siti Nawala and I'm really excited for this second episode. Today we are going to have a special chat to discuss IVCO 2023 blog post topics and make it accessible to everyone, especially those who don't have the time to read this amazing blog post by Dr. Amjad Saleem. So our special guest today, we are going to break it down in this interview. The blog post titled Reimagining Volunteering Needs a Decolonization Lens. Here is what we should be cautious of. So let's all say a big hello to Dr. Amjad Saleem, who is the Manager of Volunteering Youth and Education Development at the IFRC, International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. In this role, he is in charge of orchestrating strategies and outreach around youth engagement, volunteer mobilization, and education in emergency and non-emergency programs. He wrote the blog post we're talking about today, and we are very excited to have you on board to help us understand it better and unpacking the idea around decolonization topic in volunteering for development. So welcome very much, Dr. Amjad.
Thank you very much, Wala, for having me.
Yeah, so we're just going to proceed to the first question of the day in unpacking the topic. So the concept of decolonizing volunteering is mainly discussed in the piece. Could you explain the aspects that need to be addressed as part of decolonization process, especially considering the dynamics of the global volunteering landscape? Over to you, Doctor.
Thank you. I think even when we first start thinking about volunteering, right? I think the terminology volunteering is something that is not something that is common to our part of the world, right? It's a concept, it's a language, it's a terminology that has come from what was our colonizers, right? Well, what was the West? I mean, the idea of the terminology of volunteering, even in the English language, it's an English language term. So I think that when we think about volunteering, when we think about what volunteering entails, and in most cases, when you look at the history of volunteers, either it was people who were coming as missionaries, coming to spread the good word, or taking time off because of they wanted to do something, and that is something that we even see nowadays as well, right? You take time off to be able to go to another country to help. You do a gap year. All of those things, all of those aspects of it speak to a very type of privilege and a type of power that most people in the global south perhaps do not recognize or do not subscribe to. Now, of course, when you dig into what does volunteering look like, I think few will disagree that the concept of service, the concept of doing something to help someone, is not alien and is part of parcel of our culture, of our traditions, of our religions. It's about helping someone when we're in need. All of that is there. So I think that when we think about what does volunteering overall represent, I think that there is very much a recognition that this is something that we all subscribe to. But if you take the term volunteer and you ask someone what you think about volunteering, immediately an image comes to the mind, right? And that image for me is very much part of the colonial legacy that we have, right? I mean, a large portion of these big organizations or these volunteer organizations were, particularly when you look at the countries that were colonized, these were largely led by women who came from middle or upper class, who really didn't have to worry about earning something. And so they spent their free time doing service, right? And that was how that concept came. Now, in our part of the world, we can see remnants of that, right? We can see some of these big old organizations that are there still have the same model. People who come from wealthy families, largely women, are getting together and doing something to help others. So I think when we talk about voluntary or volunteering, I think that the concept as a whole needs to be unpacked, or the terminology needs to be unpacked. And that for me is part of why I was sort of saying that when we think about this, we need to think about very carefully what we mean by decolonizing, what we need to address that perspective, because the lens in which we're looking at something, the lens in which we use to articulate something and talk about something, I think is very important. And that's what we need to kind of start to be much more aware of.
All right, thanks, Dr. Amjad. So basically, what I've gathered from your point is that when you talk about women having extra time committing to volunteering, it's almost like they are already at this position of power where they have the privilege to serve others. So serving others is not necessarily the primary activity for them, but actually is something that a leisure activity. So, right. Moving on, talking again regarding the blog post, it suggests that the current understanding and discussion of volunteering are influenced by colonial values. Can you please explain how colonial legacy has shaped the way volunteering is portrayed and understood today in today's context?
Yeah, I mean, I think again we have this perspective of the savior, right? And this is again, volunteering is all about the savior complex, the savior mentality, right? That we are going in, we have the answers to the problems that are facing people, and so we are going to go in and tell people what they should not do. Now, that's really the part of where volunteering comes from, is also linked to the international development and humanitarian kind of landscape, right? I mean, we go in to help people. We have volunteers either through different Peace Corps or all of these things to go in to help. All of this comes the legacy, or I call them the grandchildren of of the colonial periods of the missionaries, who pretty much said the same thing, right? I mean, the missionaries came and they sought to change social, political, economic structures of countries in the global south. They came to sort of say that, you know, that the agency of the black and brown subjects was not considered, that they didn't have the agency, and so we had to come in to do something. We still have that today, right? I mean, we still have that sort of white savior mentality where people often, like I said, yeah, and I'm not saying that this is not needed. It's absolutely needed, but it's absolutely encouraged and listening. But we have gap year students coming from America or the US, coming to Malaysia, or coming to Singapore, or coming to Africa, or to other parts of Asia, wanting to go and build houses and do things like that. And there's no agency, right? They're coming in and they're coming to help, and they're coming to do, and then they go back. So I think we are replicating that whole perspective, because even when you think about the definition of volunteering, right, the original kind of thing is like, you know, it's about giving certain amount of hours of your time a week, a month, or whatever, and that's considered volunteering. Now, again, if you have the ability to give those hours, that's good. But most of us, particularly in the global south, it's very difficult to articulate, I can give those hours. But when there's a crisis, when there's a death in the family, or people rally around, right? So the idea of doing something to help others is not new. We do it. It's part of our traditions. It's part of our religious and ethnic and faith and cultural traditions. We help. You know, we have that, but we're not articulating it in a way that is indigenous to us. And I think this is part of the challenge that I have. So I think from my perspective, when we think about the official definitions about volunteering, when we think about how volunteering is conceptualized now, it's very much still done from that lens of a global north coming down, helping the underprivileged without much agency from themselves, without understanding what service means to the community that we're working with, without understanding what is needed to build and lift the and strengthen capacities of the communities that we're working with. And I think this is where we need to start that consideration, right? I mean, and the fact that we also might want to deal with our own lived experiences of oppression, injustice, corruption, right? It's not just part of where that need and service is there is because we already have our own challenges of oppression, and we would like to explore that, but often we're not. So we are not given an opportunity to kind of have that conversation or to kind of see how we can disrupt the system that perpetuates that. So I think from my perspective, we just need to be a little bit more intentional about how we approach this conversation.
I do agree with you. So I've just been reading this book, Humankind by Rutger Bregman, which highlights the very nature of human is to help others.
Yes.
But yeah. So, but in this context, when we are trying to volunteer and give service to others, we just need to be intentional, like you said, intentional, and try to understand the local context and how is it that we can contribute into bringing them, not to bring over our own definition of prosperity, success, education, as long as we're just trying to facilitate these processes for these communities and what is it that they need that suits to their own context, their own local context. All right. So the piece highlights the historical significance of volunteering within local communities. Can you please elaborate how volunteering has been an important part of human society and what is its significance in times of tragedy as well as in other contexts?
As someone who works in the humanitarian sector, right? I mean, I know for a fact that whenever a tragedy strikes, whenever there's a natural disaster, for example, the humanitarian agencies take at least minimum of a day to 2 days to respond. But that doesn't mean that no one has responded. That means the local community has got together to help, right? And I think it's very important there, whether it's the mosques or the temples or the gurdwaras or the churches, whether it's the schools, whether it's whoever, we have a tradition of people helping. Now, that tradition is defined differently in different cultures and sort of, I would ask, in Malaysia, what is the Malay word for that, right? In South Africa, they talk about Ubuntu, I am because you are, right? We prosper together. So I think that there's a number of different understandings. Now, I think the challenge is that we haven't really fully attributed those traditions and those cultures to this, right? I mean, if you go in Malaysia, if you go to a local village where there's a mosque or whatever, you know that, for example, during times of Ramadan, people will come, we will give food, they will help the poor. That's also part of the gift of service, right? And that's what volunteering is. They will clean the prayer places, or they will clean, and there's a funeral in a house, the whole neighborhood gets together and comes in and and looks after the widow or whatever. That's all part of the concept of what we understand or what we should understand by volunteering. It's just that we don't necessarily consider that. We don't necessarily articulate that. It's not considered official, but it's there. And I think it's a shame that we don't consider that. We don't pay attention to that. It's also a shame that our cultures determine how much we volunteer, because currently, if you think about it, most people think about volunteering as an unpaid job, right? People's impression is that if you say you volunteer, sometimes it's not necessarily a good impression, right? Because people feel like it's there, But I think we have to change them into, because people have sought to attribute certain things with the concept of volunteering. So I think that if we are to unpack from our own traditions, unpack our own understandings of what volunteering, it's a richness that we can bring, right? There's definitely some great stuff that's come because of volunteering from places like the US, UK. They've helped to build that. But we also realize that there's additional challenges that we need to be aware of, that we need to address, and that's where I'm sort of coming to with my piece, is just you need to think differently about this, right? Even the concept of volunteering, um, where was it born from? Who were the first? And if you ask people who were the first volunteers, they might actually go back and sort of say, well, actually, the first volunteers were these people who came from the global north to the global south. They were not. They were also people within our own communities, right? Who helped, who do this, but we don't necessarily consider that. But I think we still have a mindset that when we talk about volunteering, it's more of a Western European thing, and it's very structured and everything else. But how about the volunteering that takes place at our communities? They don't call it volunteering; they call it something else. They have a different terminology for it. They have a different understanding. But it's volunteering. I mean, the essence is the same. They hope that they're serving, but we don't take that into consideration. And so, as a consequence, it's very important for us to change that. If someone comes with a resume that says, I volunteered with YSS, most probably an employer would go, oh yeah, great. They volunteered with YSS. That's brilliant. That's a great sort of organizer. I recognize that. But yeah, what if someone comes and says, I am a volunteer, I volunteer at my local mosque and I'm there. I don't know whether an employer would actually treat that seriously. Why not? What is the difference between doing something with YSS and doing something with your local mosque, right? Although YSS is a structured organization and absolutely needs there. But why do we pay more attention to someone who says I've done something with YSS, as opposed to I did something in my local community with my local mosque, or I ran a food bank or something like that. But it's very much, it's coming from a local perspective or traditional perspective. Again, because we don't attribute that same level of importance and things. So what I'm trying to do is to kind of challenge people that when we talk about decolonizing, we have to think about terminology, understanding the concepts, what is it we're doing, but also recognizing that we also have our own experiences, lived experiences that we can contribute, but also our lived experiences that have challenges that we need to also adjust and discuss, right? So volunteering from outside, coming from outside here, is very much important. It's important to have that cross fertilization, but if you don't understand the context, then I think it's a challenge. We also have a challenge that most of our volunteering, like I said, we have people coming from the global north to the global south. Volunteers, they come, they spend a gap year, they spend 6 months or a summer period building houses or whatever. And I know YSS does this as well. You send people to other parts of Asia, ASEAN countries. Does YSS send anyone to the US or to the UK to go and build houses there? Or somewhere else. I don't know. Maybe you do, but I would be very interested to kind of know that, because then that's important. That it's not just about people coming from the US to Malaysia or to Vietnam or wherever, but it's people from Vietnam going across that side.
I guess it's about challenging the flow of yeah, where does this services comes from, and where does this, yeah, and where it goes to. And well, quoting back the first points that you mentioned, the tradition of helping in Malaysia, I think it's the most relevant phrase will be gotong royong. So and it has been a centuries long, I think, tradition where whenever there's a big fest, big fest or big events coming up, communities will just rally up, and every component of the community will know what to do. Okay, so this lady will be distributing the rice. This lady will be just yeah. So this house will be doing the cooking. But it's something that is informal, and it's not an established activity, I would say, because then right now when we have the term volunteering, we use sukarelawan. So that's it. That's in our name, in YSS, Yayasan Sukarelawan Siswa. And then again, I regarding the position and our role in the community, especially, for example, during COVID. So I was in Yogyakarta for a few months, and I really love how the informal communities and the informal way that they do things to control and help to manage the communities during COVID is through informal setup. But it was never really something that is known or established or recognized, because it's just been there all this time. So the people will take it for granted.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
And I think that's important. I think you've written the informality of community mobilization and organization is what we're looking at, right? And that is there, and that is part of our DNA, right? I mean that,
Yeah.
and it is out of that that the formal volunteering has been mobilized, right? It's there. We've given it structure, but we cannot sort of do away with that informality, and to recognize that informality is actually very extremely important. and
Yeah.
and for me, that's part of that decolonized approach. It is the fact that we recognize that there's informality. We recognize that local communities already have systems and mechanisms to help
Mm.
themselves. It's not like they're waiting for someone to come from outside to go and come and help to build them houses. No, they would probably do it if they had some other opportunities, or they were pointed in the right direction, or they were accompanied through the process, right? So I think that recognition is important.
Mhm. Because it's in our instinct and in our, like you say, in our human DNA to
Yeah.
help and to mobilize ourselves. Right, great. So the post introduces the idea of intersectionality and its role in volunteering action. Can you provide an example of how intersectional understanding is important for addressing different layers of oppression and creating effective volunteering initiatives that empower local communities?
Yeah, I mean, I think intersectionality has really come up anyway over the last few years, in particular when people have started talking about diversity, equity, anti-racism, discrimination, all of that, right? Because the idea of intersectionality is that you are not you are not just a homogeneous person, right? You have multiple representations and identities, and each one of them are important. Each one of them inform you, and each one of them also adds an element to your vulnerability, right? So the two of us on this podcast, we both have different identities that make us vulnerable in different ways, right? Even though we may come from the same maybe social strata or whatever, but we still have that. And so the idea of intersectionality is to really understand that our identities intersect, and they're multiple, and each one of them are important. Each one of them can contribute to a vulnerability, right? So you can be male, but if you're male, but you're of a certain age, from a certain ethnic community, of a certain faith, maybe you have more chances to be vulnerable than someone else. Likewise, if you're female who's has a certain age, disability, all of that things, you are vulnerable somewhere else. And so, as a consequence, your vulnerability is influenced by this intersectionality of identity. Now, I think likewise, when we think about volunteering, when we think about oppression, that's the same thing, right? If you're someone of color who's a woman, who perhaps comes from a religious minority, those are elements that the levels of oppression might be different to someone else. So I think that when we think about volunteering and addressing these issues, it's also important to understand that intersectionality about power, privilege, and oppression, and not to kind of say, okay, we're going to do this and this is going to address everyone, right? It's like people often sort of say we want to work, like people sort of, we want to work with this community, but I'm sorry, that community doesn't exist, right? People of that community exist, but that community as a whole is not homogeneous, right? When you talk about Malaysia, Malaysia is not a homogeneous country. Malaysia is heterogeneous. It has different cultures, different faiths, and even within the the cultures and the faiths, you have differences. Those who live in KL versus those who live in Langkawi, or those who live in Perak. All of those, there's different. Even your foods are different. All of those contribute to your identity, and as a consequence, when you think about volunteering, you need to have a much more nuanced understanding of the context. And when you need to have a much more nuanced understanding of how people mobilize. Even how people mobilize is different, right? Because of various things, because of local traditions, local cultures, local politics, all of that thing. So I think it's important that we have a much more nuanced understanding of of that of that perspective. And I think this is what we think about, right? We need to think about what we call equity, but equity means that we treat each one as they wish to be, as they deserve to be treated. And I think you may have seen that there's always this diagram that is used when people talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, right? So there's a picture of three people, one really tall, one sort of medium height, one short, and they're trying to look at a baseball match, right? And there's a fence. So the tall person is the only one who can look at the fence. So that's one of exclusion. Then what they do is that they give each one rocks. So each one stands on the rock, right? So the tall one stands on the rock, the medium one stands on the rock, the short one stands on the rock. But then again, only two people can see. So that's based on the fact that you're talking about equality. We're treating everyone equal. We're going to give. Now you think about equity. And so in the equity perspective, you give the short person 3 rocks so that person can stand up. Give the medium person 2 rocks, and then the tallest person you don't need to give him because he can stand over the fence. He can look over the fence. There you're addressing the needs based on the person. So I think this is something that we need to think about. And then justice is you take away the fence completely so everyone can see, right? But if we're thinking about volunteering, I think it's about what do we mean by equitable? What's an equitable approach to volunteering? What does that look like, right? How are we understanding the various manifestations of oppression that are there? How do we have that local understanding that allows us to address agency, enable representation? I think that's what we need to start thinking about. And it's very important because all our identities are very important to us. Amartya Sen talks about multiple identities informing us. And so, we're not just male, female, or this faith or that faith. We're not just Malay or British or whatever. We have that. You may be vegetarian. You may be, since you're from Malaysia, you're probably either a Liverpool fan or a Manchester United fan or there, right? Now, all of that is very important, right? But the fact that you're a Liverpool fan or Manchester United fan is not important in this conversation. Maybe it is, but it's not important in this conversation. But the fact that we're volunteers is important in this conversation, right? But volunteering is part of our identity. But equally, being a football fan is part of our identity. And we cannot undervalue and underestimate that. It's just we need to recognize where different things come together. And I think sometimes we have a tendency of painting everything with the same brush, and that's very challenging.
Thank you, Dr. Amjad. That was very thoughtful, and it just got me to think about all the volunteering activities, volunteering programs that I've been involved in or just been exposed to. And it also relates to how far does the impact of that program or that volunteering mission can reach. So for example, I was in a volunteering project for water awareness, but the targeted groups of the program are those who are already in the scene. So, for example, the students of water and hydrology engineering section. So, where where is the community that needs it the most, who is impacted the most by this issue? So, are they included in this conversation? So, and how is it that this program will directly impact these communities if they are not in the conversation, right?
Absolutely. I mean, I've often, I mean, on these projects, I've often gone to communities where we've actually had this, right? Where we've gone and people have gone and built wells because they want to supply water, right? And everything else. And then, after 1 year, the well is not there, the well is not working, or whatever, because no one bothered to consult the community to ask them, do you have someone who actually, if something goes wrong with the well or with the pump, who can fix it, right? Or actually, I mean, I once went to a project where the community said, well, yeah, we actually didn't want a well, but the guys came and they built the well. So we're not going to say no, right? But if they'd asked us, we would have wanted something else. So I think it's we are again, we often forget that, and it's that colonial patronizing attitude that we have. All of us have it. That when we are serving, that somehow the person that we are serving, somehow, because they're in need, they lack agency to actually think about anything, right? Um, and it's a very dangerous thing to do because we're thinking we're coming that as if we have the answers. But actually, the best thing to do is to come and, okay, what is it that you need that I can help you with, right? What do you need there? Now, there are sometimes when we can't do that, and we say, okay, fine, we will try and do something else. But just that agency to and that, which is a form of dignity, right? Which is a form of respect, that we actually value you for yourself. I think we lack that, and I think it's something we need to have the humility to acknowledge and to actually do that better.
The stakeholder engagement is key here.
Yeah.
Right?
But even for me, stakeholder engagement is a very Western NGO term, by the way, right? It's what NGOs do. Yes, we do it and we tick the box. We have consulted the community, but it has to be more organic, right? We have to bring the community with us.
Okay. So, moving on to the next question. Your piece emphasizes the need for a diverse range of voices and perspectives. So I think this also relates to what we've discussed previously. To contribute to discussions on decolonization and volunteering. How can we navigate language barriers, cultural differences, and understanding to ensure that this dialogue is inclusive and impactful on a global scale?
I think it's a very difficult thing. I mean, I would sort of say let's start local, right? So let's start with where we have influence on this, right? So on a global scale, sometimes it's very difficult. But where is your circle of influence that you have, and what can you do to ensure that there's a diversity of voices that are there? Who is at the table, right? Look at who's at the table. Be deliberate about that, right? Be deliberate about who's at the table. Do you have a variety of age ranges? Do you have different genders? Do you have different ethnicities? All of those things are very tangible things that are there that you can actually do, right? So we ensure that in multicultural country like Malaysia, for example, when we have discussions, when we have panels, or when we have this, we are ensuring that we have as much as possible. Sometimes it's difficult, right? But as much as possible, we have made allowances for that type of representation, because diversity is a fact. hide away from that. The inclusion is how we act on that. So how can we deliberately go out and make that? And often that means, particularly when we talk about events and discussions and things like that, it actually means that we might have to take difficult decisions, right? Sometimes it's more expensive to have translation. It's more expensive to ensure that we have sign language, or we have all of these things. But I think it's important that at least if we try and do things that at least show people that we are trying, right? We're trying to make it accessible for people with mobility impairment. We're trying to make it we have sign language or whatever, or we have in different languages, because not everyone speaks English, or other languages. I think these are important. But then again, what I also sort of say that it's not only that, it's also about, for me, and this is where the decolonizing thing comes. It's also about understanding local traditions and cultures and everything else, and faith, right? So when we host big meetings or this thing, are we doing it at a time when we know that one community may not be able to come because it's close to their religious holidays? But we don't know that, right? Because it's faith has faith has faith has is not part of our equation, but it's part of someone's identity. It's part of someone's lived experience, right? So if we have something that, for example, in the when I, particularly for me, working where I am in Europe, it's very difficult sometimes to, you have meetings that are scheduled around the Raya season, right? But for them, it's not in their radar screen, right? But we need to make sure that it's there, and then that can be for other communities as well. Or you have dietary restrictions, or these are some of the things that we need to be much more aware of, to make things much more inclusive, so that people feel like they're acknowledged, they're respected, that you actually see them. And I think this is what we need to be a lot more aware of. The other thing, of course, particularly when it comes to volunteering, is that people need to be able to recognize themselves in the volunteers that you have, right? So, for example, if you're sending volunteers to specific communities or whatever, if they don't speak the language, if they don't themselves see themselves in that, then it's a challenge. So how do we ensure that we are getting a vast array of people who are able to come and contribute, to speak the language, who are from different cultures, all of that? And it's a slow process as well. But what we do is we take the easy way out, because it's easier. It's easier just to kind of do an event, because otherwise we're in time pressures, we're in budget pressures, we're on this and that, and we take shortcuts. And my pushback is, even in the shortcuts that you have taken, that you've intentionally taken that shortcut. So you've evaluated all of the opportunities, and you still take that. That's still okay, right? Because you don't have all the money in the world. You don't have, if we had all the money, we would make everything inclusive. We'd have translation, we'd have sign language, we'd have all of this, and we can't. We just can't afford it. But have we intentionally thought about it and then arrived at the decision that, yes, we cannot do it, and that's why we're doing it? Or is it something that we just didn't think about? It's an afterthought, and then that's what so I mean, this is why I'm sort of saying that even in the work that I'm not sort of saying that everything needs to be always inclusive. We try as much as possible to be inclusive, but we have thought about it, we've tried it, and then we take the decision that, okay, we can't do this, we can't do that.
I agree on the afterthought aspect, because that is almost in everything, in every aspect of our lives, and it doesn't even it's not even just volunteering, it's everywhere. So for example, that it's my life experience is when I'm at the musalla or at the masjid, and the facility, the amenities for women, for Muslim women is just facilities are just as inaccessible as it is for men's.
Yeah.
So it is something that is an afterthought for the planners, for the architects, so forth. Yeah. But
Absolutely. And I think so so we need to be a lot more intent. We have to have a lot more intent driven in what we're doing, right? So even when we're talking about panels, right, let's make sure that we are able to make it representative, make it diverse in terms of gender, all of those things. And so it's important that we start to articulate that culture when we're going. We're no longer afterthoughts, right? You can no longer be afterthoughts. I think we have to understand that diversity is what makes our communities, our societies, our countries, our nations. That's what makes it great, right? Because of that of that diversity, you know.
You should be at the very beginning of anything to set intent to make sure that our project of anything is inclusive, it is equitable for everyone, and ensuring that impact is thorough and can reach as far as we can. But we still, at the same moment, we still have to acknowledge the limits that we have.
Absolutely. I mean, and
challenges.
That's the thing. But you've acknowledged the limits after going through that thinking, right?
Yeah.
So that's because you can't be perfect, and which is why my question is, or my pushback when you ask the question about how do we take it to global scale, I'm like, well, actually, global is difficult. Let's just start local. Let's just start with what we can do. We have influence about what we can do, right? And then hopefully there is a trickle-on effect, right? And let's try and make sure that within our own circles, within our own influence, that we are able to push this agenda slightly forward. And I think that's important.
So it has been a very informative and thoughtful session with Dr. Amjad Saleem when we talk about the blog that you've written, Reimagining Volunteering Needs a Decolonization Lens. And I hope that the viewers, the readers of the blogs, as well as the listeners to this podcast can take as much information and as much thoughts into decolonization in volunteering for development. So do you have any final words, Dr. Amjad, for future volunteers, global volunteers?
I mean, I think, even when you're going into volunteering, you know, it's volunteering is I don't want to. It's not a blessing. It's the opportunity opportunity to serve, right? Is a huge blessing, right? It's a huge blessing because you're given a chance to share your skills, your knowledge, your time, to work with someone, to help them through challenges. I don't think we need to we never should underestimate that. We never should underestimate what we're doing, even if it's a small thing. But we should always also remember that, with all humility, that we are in a privileged position, that just because we're in that position, we're not better than the person that we're working with. In fact, the person that we're working with may actually have much more knowledge about things than us. So I think the question for us is really, how do we create a conducive or an open environment that we're able to work and learn together? Volunteering is about learning, right? It's that learning process. I mean, a lot of what I have achieved and what I learned is based on my volunteering. I didn't learn it in university. I learned it with engaging with people, interacting with people, understanding. And it's a huge privilege. It's a huge privilege to be able to do that, to be able to work with communities and understand the challenges. And I think we just need to be humble enough to recognize that, right? And so for me, I think my closing thing is that, I think let's just be humble enough to recognize the diversity of the concepts of serving people, not to bring back the idea of human dignity, so that we treat everyone as they wish to be treated, as we wish to be treated, and that we want to do better, not because it's doing something right, because it's the right thing to do, right? And so I think it's important that we just bring that philosophy back. And thank you for allowing me to ramble on for an hour or so.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amjad. It was our privilege and our honor to have you on our IVCO podcast, and also for your very engaging and thoughtful piece, blog piece on decolonization in volunteering. So to wrap up, I think this has been a very insightful session for myself, even as YSS alumni. So I've been with YSS since 2015, and overall, I agree that volunteering has made me humble enough to know that to be of service, we need to understand that we are not always right, and being right is actually is depending on everyone's perspective. So yeah, and that, as you've mentioned, we need to start local within our own circle of influence, because that is where we can contribute the most, and with the highest and the most understanding of the context of what we are serving, of what we are in service of. So thank you so much again, Dr. Amjad Saleem, and we've had fun. I hope you've had fun today, and I'm really hoping for this blog to reach even further. So to our viewers and listeners, don't forget to explore the conference website at www.ifco2023.org to read the blog posts and more. If you haven't registered yet, this is your time to grab this opportunity to be a part of IVCO 2023 Kuala Lumpur. So stay tuned for the next episode. Thank you so much, and bye.